Hello, I'm Abby Smith and I will be doing a presentation on Tourette Syndrome. Tourette Syndrome was discovered in 1885 by George de la Tourette, and it is a syndrome that affects a lot of people. Most people are unknown that they actually have the Tourette Syndrome. Tourette Syndrome is a disability within the brain without some developments or lacking thereof development there, and it is made up of many components. One of the major components is known as Tourette Syndrome. Many people believe that Tourette Syndrome consists of loud yelling of obscure words, when really that is one of the least common components of Tourette Syndrome. The most common example of a Tourette would be bending the neck like this, or making movements with your mouth such as this, repetitive opening, or moving your eyes back and forth repetitively. Those are the most common that you will see from people with Tourette's. They could also involve jumping up and down many times or tapping their foot, and it's just a repetitive motion. Tics are passed on as well. So if you have duplicate people in your family that have Tourette syndrome and are affected by tics, there's a good chance that when one person has a tic, that tic is going to move on to the next person, and it could very well come back to the person who first had it, just because it keeps going. And if a person catches another person without Tourette syndrome doing something, they might catch on to that, and that might become their next tic. And tics are very complex. It can be anything really that could be diagnosed as a tic. In order to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, the individual needs to be displaying motions and having tics for a year consistently. So that's, for an example, if a person is demonstrating tics and then that tic decreases or stops completely for 3 months, that would not be diagnosed as a tic or Tourette syndrome because it was not consistent. Along with that, tics can be anything that is not hurtful for the individual, or it could be something that is dangerous for the individual, such as punching themselves in the stomach until it hurts. They have this inner fight with themselves that, you know, if I do it lightly many times until it hurts, that would be fine. Or should I just hit myself once really hard in the stomach till it hurts, till I feel that same pain, and then I'm done with it. That's something that people with Tourette syndrome battle with every day. Another component of Tourette syndrome involves OCD, which is known as obsessive compulsive disorder. Many people have heard of that before. An example that a lot of people use would be the washing of the hands, or tapping by a light switch, or having to check your car door and make sure it's locked so many times until you feel satisfied with that. And these are things that people who are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, or just simply suffer from OCD or tics, they cannot control this, and they have to do it until they feel satisfied. If they don't, they might feel like they will get in trouble, or they will feel scared for themselves that they did not complete this task. Another component that goes along with Tourette syndrome and is very common is ADHD, active hyper disorder, and that's actually active hyperactivity disorder. And this is common in young people right now. A lot of people think it's overdiagnosed, but it is one of the main components that go along with Tourette syndrome. And this is the inattention to detail, not being able to sit still in class, not being able to concentrate. And that is very common with people who have Tourette syndrome. But I want to point out that people who have Tourette syndrome and they have tics and they have OCD and they have the ADHD, they don't always have those together, and they're not diagnosed together, which is a funny thing to point out. A lot of people who have Tourette syndrome have ADHD, but not a lot of people who are diagnosed with ADHD have Tourette syndrome. So it's kind of different in that way. There's a few ways to cope having Tourette syndrome. One of the ways is through music or light therapy. And music therapy can go by either listening to music or producing the music themselves. A lot of people who actually play piano or play the guitar or play drums, they forget that they have the Tourette syndrome and they're not affected by their tics at that time because their brain is off in a different place and it's feeling relaxed and calm. And that can go with light therapy as well. Doctors have invented these goggles that people use, and in those goggles it shows different lights at different brightnesses and different colors, and that just helps stimulate the mind to help it relax, which is very common source right now for light therapy. Another way, or another form of therapy, is that group and the individual therapy, which also helps some people who suffer from Tourette syndrome. And then there's also the part of medication that's always there for Tourette syndrome as well. I do not support that, although it does work for some people. My nephews and my niece actually have Tourette syndrome, and they choose to use that medication as an aid. It is one of their main ways of controlling the Tourette syndrome. Again, I think it just depends on the severity of the Tourette's and the different tics that are being brought on by the Tourette syndrome. So that's an individual decision that each family needs to make for themselves. There are different side effects that can go along with the medication, such as hallucinations, heart problems. Just depends on the medication itself. So it's very risky, but it's all a decision to each their own. Again, my name is Abby Smith, and this is my presentation on Tourette syndrome.